welcome everyone to this, whatever it is, the numbers are increasing as we go on from month to month producing this show. I think of it now as a bit of a show. It started off as a very simple exchange between architects and other architects and allied professionals, as well as civil society. But surprisingly, it has gone on month after month for 4 years now, over 4 years, which is a strange sign of the times. I'm not quite sure how to take it, but I'm quite glad that we are continuing, and especially today we are doing the fourth panel discussion in the series we started last year, which was on the future of Delhi. This started at a time when there was a lot of hue and cry in the city about the very large government projects, housing projects, which are being undertaken in New Delhi. We all know about them, and since the matter had gone to court, there were stay orders, and there was a number of people who actually got really quite concerned. This forum is actually for the citizens of Delhi. You know, it's architects, because architects, I believe, have some responsibility in terms of the built environment. Don't ask architects to own up to that, because I think that's the last thing they want to do. And but you know, people are, citizens are what constitutes the life of a city. So it's an attempt really to get citizens. Now, we had the first panel discussion there for, I think, about a year ago, in which we were quite serious about, you know, what's going on. I mean, Delhi was designed 100 years ago by this British architect, New Delhi was, and that was the last major intervention in this settlement, which is, as you know, a very ancient settlement. It's been around for a long time. Now, after, and then the next one, we debated that whether the utopia that was planned by the authorities when New Delhi was made, whether that utopia had become a dystopia, whether we had actually reversed our inverted our aspirations into something really quite unpalatable. And so that concentrated on environmental limits and things like that. The third one, we actually went to look at public places, because we put the proposition forward that we can debate about environmental issues and planning issues, very important ones, as they are, but actually urbanity resides in public places. This was the proposition of the third panel discussion we had, that unless citizens claimed public places, there was not much chance of the urban becoming real. And it was just a notion which you could deal with in the abstract and all that. But so now the fourth one has gone one step further about the notion of publicness, and we are actually saying that is it not possible to think of the city as a cultural enterprise rather than as an engineering configuration. You see, cities for at least 200 years, 150 years maybe, have largely been developed. Urban development has arisen as the work of engineers and town planners. Architects have been rather marginal. You know, they beautify parts of cities, but really they're not taken very seriously. And but engineers and planners have been doing this to our city. And I have lived in Delhi since 1952, and I have noted that Delhi, in spite of the huge investment of human resource and capital to make it a better place, it's the capital of the country, it has become progressively worse as a place to live in. And it's a matter of fact. You can't debate this. So obviously there is some disjunction between what we call policy in urban development and reality in terms of the lives of citizens. And today's panel has been, they've very kindly consented to come and debate the 3 or 4 questions which have emerged from this proposition. And I'll just read out the questions to start with so that the audience is informed. I'd also like to say that the format of the discussion, for those who have not been to one of these earlier, is that the panelists take about 8 to 10 minutes. We are one panelist short today because Virkeen had to go out of the city, and Vishal has come to in her place. But Shonalika Kaul, the historian, has actually not been able to make it, and somebody who was to replace her has fallen ill. So I've been advised to try and act as a panelist myself, so I'm taking a little longer in time. I normally don't do that. But I will take a little time. But the panelists, which are 3, I will introduce them in a minute. They take about 8 to 10 minutes to make a sort of presentation, to make their pitch, if you like. Sorry? Provocation, if you'd like to put it like that. Yes, that's a good idea. So after that, we invite questions from the audience. The purpose of all of these meetings of the Architecture and Society series is actually to engage with the citizens of Delhi in an informed discussion. So then we have the audience questions, and towards the end, when we see that people are starting to leave, we ask the panelists to come back and make some point of their own. In any case, they'll be answering questions as you raise them. So maybe they can make some final concluding statements. But this is roughly the format. And today's panel is on my right is Swati Janu, who is an architect by training, and her practice is more to do with marginalized situations in building. I can put it like that, but she can explain it better herself. She teaches as well as practices, and is going to perhaps the first one to speak. You could, since you're sitting there. Then you can, and you have some slides to show, so we'll have some visual material to keep us active. Then we have Ratish Nanda, who is the director of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture in Delhi. Am I right in that? That we can quietly keep below the surface. So Ratish is also an old associate of mine, and we go back a long time. He is an architect by training, but he was trained in a strange school where architecture was actually being explored quite from first principles. And he's one of the first batch of that school. So he therefore came out, I guess, with certain dimensions about the discipline which perhaps were not conventional and expected of the more traditional colleges of architecture. But Ratish has done remarkable work in conservation. He is really one of the leading conservation architects of the country and perhaps of this part of the world. So without more ado, there's a lot of things that can be said about Ratish, but we all admire the work that he's doing, and very happy that he's joined us today for this discussion. Vishal, there on my left, is another architect by training. The social scientists who are supposed to be with us are not here today, I'm sorry to say. Normally we don't have all architects on the panel. I'm also an architect, but in severe denial. And so I'm not a social scientist, I'm not anything else either. So Vishal is also a you're a digital artist as well. I can put it like that? And you do site-specific installations? Artist is fine, all right. So he does, but I must say that what you do is something quite, because he does urban installations, site-specific installations in urban localities. So therefore, it's a very fitting that he should be part of the panel when we are trying to look at the city as a forum for cultural exchange, not just as a place where you get bad water out of pipes and your sewage is not treated and your roads are clogged and your air is not fit to breathe. That is the work of our best of our engineers and town planners, guided very well by the best of architects and town planners from the Western world, who are their mentors. However, we have a chance to talk about the city in perhaps slightly different way. And having taken up too much time now, may I request Swati to please give us your provocation, you call it. Oh, the questions, yes. Would you want to read them out? Please.
So the questions Mr. Ganju had kindly set up. One is, which the panelists are expected to address, is the notion of social equity central to the urban question? Number 2, can we identify what a truly inclusive city looks and whether it does so by addressing the need of weakest of the weak? 3, is urban policy inextricably linked to state authority, or can it emerge from the practice of compassion? And number 4, is the humane city a byproduct of an ethical restatement?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, despite the traffic and this being a holiday week. So to be able to talk about urban aesthetics, perhaps we need to look at a few images of the way the city is being formulated today and the kind of aesthetics that is coming up in our cities. I've taken Delhi as an example, perhaps the city we are most familiar with. So just a few slides of the kind of projects that are going on and upcoming. And I think the same projects were also talked about in the first panel discussion. So this is the Sub Smart City project in Kidwai Nagar, East Kidwai Nagar. This was a few months back. It's an older image by Ram Rahman. 3D view of the same project and similar developments in Sarojini Nagar, Naroji Nagar, and Netaji Nagar. And of course, the redevelopment of Pragati Maidan. And what are the kind of spaces, what are the kind of buildings, what are the kind of neighborhoods which are replacing, which have been replaced, which have been displaced by these developments? The Hall of Nations, we all are familiar with the demolition that took place. Similarly, Netaji Nagar, the government quarters designed by Habib Rahman, we might be familiar with, being architects. Perhaps we might not be familiar with the squatter settlements or what are commonly called as slums in our cities being raised to make way for these developments. In place of the Kidwai Nagar redevelopment project which has come up, there was a settlement of a few hundreds of houses which were demolished and resettled, pushed out to the fringes of the city. The Katputli colony eviction demolition we might all be familiar with. And similarly, there are evictions, demolitions that take place in Delhi every few weeks, which are gradually and continually pushing out the urban poor to the fringes of the city. And I think now I'm going to join the panelists with these sort of images to begin with. So our cities are being continuously built, dismantled, rebuilt, demolished, restructured, reshaped continuously. And in the process, parts of our cities go missing, and often we don't even realize these parts have gone missing. So I wanted to share two stories with you, two stories of loss, if you will. The first one is a story of the flower markets of Delhi. There used to be 3 flower markets before 2011 when they were shifted to Ghazipur. By a show of hands, how many of us have been to these flower markets? Okay. So let's say 30%. So then you might know, and to the rest, there were 3 flower markets in Connaught Place, Baba Khadak Singh Marg, in Mehroli, and in Old Delhi. And these were morning markets, so you had to get up really early to be able to, go see them. It was quite a sight. It was really nice to be able to go in the morning, quite an experience. And these were multifunctional spaces as well. So these markets operated from 4 to 9 a.m. in the morning, and by 9:30, 10, the place would be completely cleaned out, no traces of flowers, and another function would kick in. So in CP, it was a public plaza. In Old Delhi, this would become a spice market. And I think this was 2009 or 10. As a fresh graduate, bright-eyed sort of graduate, I was working with a collective. There were a few collectives which were resisting this eviction of these markets, and I was working as a part of one of them, hoping or thinking that we could stop this move, this eviction. But of course, you learn in due course. There are larger forces at play, and the shift did take place, and today the markets are at Ghazipur. And I feel that what we have lost in the process is our urban heritage, something which has existed for decades. The second story is of street performers, of traditional performing arts in the city. There are 7 traditional tribes when it comes to street performers, jugglers, acrobats or nuts, madaris, magicians. For those of us who grew up in Delhi, you might have seen many of these madaris who would come to our neighborhoods when we were children, and with their monkeys, or sometimes if you were lucky, there'd be an acrobat or a magician. But today you don't see these performers within the city anymore. You see them in smaller towns, smaller cities, you see them at the peripheries, at the fringes of the city. And also, we do not have a culture of street performers, street performances, of buskers. You go to any Southeast Asian city, you go to a European city, the public spaces are alive with those sort of convivial activities, but not here in Delhi, not in most Indian cities. And what's the reason for that? The reason lies in an act which was passed in, I think, 1876. It was called the Dramatic Performances Act, introduced by the British to stop Indians from protesting, mobilizing themselves to fight for independence. And somehow this colonial law has kind of still retained itself. Many of the states had repealed the act, but it's still active in a few states. Delhi had repealed the act, but in practice, in principle, it is still active, left to the discretion of the police. And often these decisions are based on class and caste as well, where these performers are typically seen as beggars. I remember even when we were kids, we used to see them based on what we were told by our families, that they were criminals, that we have to be careful because, and so we were afraid of them. And what has happened today is this has led to these performances, their traditional occupations being banned. And today we have the kind of spaces we have. And even if you are from a more upper middle class background, you try to put up a performance in Delhi, if you try that, it's next to impossible. It's very, very difficult. Yes, some 40 licenses. Ratish will tell you more. And so I guess what I'm trying to discuss with these two stories is the idea of aesthetics, the idea of beauty in our cities. If you look at any of the beautification drives over the last few years, they've basically translated into slum-free cities. Garibi Hatao has translated into Garibo Ko Hatao. And the kind of spaces we have are really moving towards a very, I think, a mundane, idea of what a world-class city should look like, or what a smart city should look like. So Delhi is trying to be Dubai, and Dubai is trying to be Tokyo, and there's some sort of identity complex going on. And I remember last time I was at Greha, so you had mentioned spontaneous urbanization. We were talking about spontaneous urban spaces, public spaces, which are created impromptu. And I think both the stories that I've just discussed are examples of spontaneous urban spaces through the activities, through the multifunctional spaces which are created. And slowly there seems to be a move from more more informal, self-organized, spontaneous spaces such as these to a more formal, planned sort of approach, and really beautiful. or the urban aesthetics that we are talking about is really defined as something which is ordered, which is clean, which is sanitized. And I feel the cultural identity that we're talking about, when we talk about the city as a cultural enterprise, the question that needs to be asked is whose cultural identity? Whose cultural identity is being promoted? Whose cultural identity is being supported? And whose cultural identity is being pushed outside the city? So with this provocation, I will pass on the mic to Ratish.
Well, thank you for having me, sir. As sir said, I went to something called the TVB School of Habitat Studies, which you seem not to be happy to be the founding pillar of. It was, I think, it's interesting that what you said today, because we were taught that architects have responsibility, and responsibility larger than just to the clients, but to cities. And some of us have tried to live up to that teaching for many years. Mr. Ganju failed me in first year, so it's very heartwarming to get in, appreciation today. And I think the reason he failed me was because Dr. Narayani Gupta sitting here gave me an assignment which I spent all summer all semester doing, and did not do anything else. So thank you for that also, ma'am. I think quite early on in first year of architecture school, one got involved with the thinking that not only is that social equity central to the urban project, but how much is urban history, which ma'am was teaching us, important for us as architects and planners to keep in mind while working on these cities. And so many of these questions are interlinked. The first one being about social equity, the next one being about the weakest of its weak, the cities. So, and it's been a blessing for me for the last 20 years to have worked for the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. And His Highness the Aga Khan set up the trust in the late 1970s, early 1980s. Mainly what he believes is culture to be used as a leverage to improve quality of life for those who inhabit historic cities. So the Aga Khan Historic Cities program in 30 countries across the world has tried to leverage cultural assets for social economic gain of the weakest. It's a bit sad that cities like Agra, which 3 World Heritage Sites and many more on the tentative list, or settlements such as Hazrat Nizamuddin Basti with at least 100 monuments, are really home to the poorest of the poor. It was in my college days once when we were actually walking through Chirag, Delhi, and saw this guy who was demolishing a building. And he was unemployed. This was next to his house. He had nothing to do, and he was just going with the sledgehammer at this historic building. And when confronted, he said, I'm poor, I have nothing to do, I'm breaking this down, I'll sell the stone. So for us, over the last decade, it's been quite a challenge as an interdisciplinary team. I mean, one of the reasons one is blessed to working with the Aga Khan Trust for Culture is that we have an interdisciplinary team, and I've learned a lot from my colleagues, urban planners such as Shweta Mathur, or social economic scientists such as Jyotsna Lal on the team, who have together been able to address some of these issues in an urban situation. So not only are we fixing Humayun's tomb, which is what everybody gets distracted with, but more recently we've landscaped portions of the Barapulla Nala, which with Nizamuddin on his thing, and it took us 5 years, removing something like 400 truckloads of rubbish that the residents were dumping in. And that needed to be done not only to improve the urban area, but also improve resident health, because you had all this rubbish. We had to connect something like 200 toilets to a newly established sewage system, because they were really dropping a bomb. And to be working under toilets, just dropping a bomb was quite a challenge. But I think what it does is it instills a sense of pride in the community. All of a sudden, the face of the community is not what it used to be, but it's something that that people are taking great pride in keeping clean, and it's totally the community's issue. But what is interesting is that we did not start in Nizamuddin by fixing the Baoli or fixing the monuments. We started with interventions in health, education, sanitation. We were building community toilets long before it was sexy in India to build community toilets, and that's because we realized 25% of the resident population did not have community toilets, and that's quite a big, did not have private toilets. And then you would get about 2 million visitors a year into the Nizamuddin Basti. So you desperately needed a community toilet. Similarly, women were dying in childbirth. We needed a huge health program. What we did not realize is establishing a path lab, establishing a community health program. We have in the last 6-7 years treated 470,000 patients, individuals, 470,000 individuals, because we keep a track of everybody. And the resident population of Nizamuddin is only about 18,000-19,000. So people are actually coming from across the city and outside to access free health care. It's costing us a lot of money, but it's also saving the weakest of the weak, hell of a lot of money. And all of these health, education, sanitation programs have been coupled, because we're also a team of architects and engineers, with major urban improvement exercises. And so the streets have been redone, and they've lasted 7-8 years now. I think now the various powers that be are itching to redo them. So that's going to happen. But what we realized in a baseline survey, which was quite amazing, is when we asked the community, what is your biggest problem? Everybody said Gandagi. So, this was long before Swachh Bharat. So everybody said, and then yet you would throw your waste on the streets. So we now collect waste, and over the last 5 years, the subsidy on that program has gone down from 100% to about 20%. But waste, Nizamuddin is still not as clean as we would like it to be, but that's because you get 12,000-13,000 people a day. And the street sweeping now happens only once. It used to happen 3 times a day till about 2 years ago, and now somehow it's been reduced by the municipal authority to once a day. Now the third question is the urban policy linked to state authority. And again, that is what generally, all of us, even architects and planners, take a back seat and say, damn it, this cannot be done. For example, there are X, Y, Z rules. Now, I would like to give you 2 instances where we have sort of not broken the rule, but we have convinced the authorities, the powers that be, that the rule is silly and needs to be broken. One is in Nizamuddin itself. In 2008, this 14th century stepwell collapsed, and there were 18 families living on top of the stepwell. There were 90 people living, and no toilets, no nothing. 90 people living on top. It was clear that their lives were in danger, and also the monument. And when we first had a meeting with them, the community, the Nizamis, the keepers of the shrine, said, let's fill this up, and the rasta to the dargah will become big, i.e. we can have lots more shops, happy people, everyone. And the people who were living all of a sudden felt very threatened and went to the minority commission against us, against everybody, saying we are Muslims and we are going to be evicted. From there, it took us, Shweta and me, about 4 years, over 200 meetings with every possible government department to find 18 plots of land adjacent to each other, which the government then gave us, to build for these people. So we built alternate houses. What was critical was there was no lottery. A lot of these people did not have ID cards. All the mandatory things that government, so all of them through sort of persuasion were waived, so that the people continued to live next to each other, even though far away. And we handheld them, we linked them with health insurance, we put vocational training programs, we got them employment, got their children to school. So all of that happened. But the state authority would have said, we can't give them anything. They're living on a monument. We don't recognize that. They have no ID cards. And of course, there will be a lottery, so they'll be in 20 different places rather than continue to live as a community. Which, again, my colleagues made me realize how important that was and worth chasing the government forever. Finally, I don't know whether some of you are aware, we're building a site museum. It's in the middle of the World Heritage Site. Again, there are various laws. There is a law which prohibits 100 meters, building within 100 meters. It's a silly law. It has caused more damage to heritage than done any benefit because it's made people anti-conservation. And we were told, build the museum 2 kilometers away or in Okhla. So, you don't want to build Humayun's Tomb Site Museum in Okhla. So the building is there, it's underground, but it took us several years to convince multiple authorities that this was a facility for the site and needed to be at the site. So the law has since then been changed. But again, I think it took hell of a lot of effort. If for both these instances, on hindsight, if one realized that there was so much effort, one would probably have given up at the onset. Finally, is the humane city a byproduct of a restatement? And here I would like to talk about Sundar Nursery. I don't know whether any of you have been or heard about Sundar Nursery, but it's a 90-acre landscaped garden that we've created, designed by Professor Muhammad Shahir, which hopes to become the sort of hub for Delhi, just like Central Park is for New York. And it's been very encouraging to see how many people have adopted it, from Afghan families who 50 of them would come and picnic every day of the week, which is fantastic, to people of all sort of walks of life. And listening to Swati talk, I think it will be great if we can get some of these street performers who are considered illegal under the Beggary Act, nothing else. Okay, well, thank God. But maybe we can get them in a sustainable manner, or not sustainable, a regular manner into Sundar Nursery, some of them. And it would be nice to revive some of these street art that we've all grown up with, but now it's all been pushed to the things. Again, you mentioned about performances. We've created performance spaces both in Nizamuddin Basti, in Humayun's Tomb, in Sundar Nursery. Yet to do a performance requires absurd amount of licenses. Every time we do a performance in a planned amphitheater, we have to have a fire engine on standby. I mean, and that means money, that means permissions, that means running around. And how many people can afford to do that? How many artists can afford to do that? We would love to have a lot more performances, both in Sundar Nursery and elsewhere in the city, but it's a racket, and it's something that that is really interfering. I don't know what you feel, but it's really interfering in Delhi being a creative space.
Tough act to follow. Ashish called me a couple of days and I had to fill in for Virkan. So I'm also saying sorry on her behalf that she can't be here, and I hope that I can fill in that. And I'm also going to say that I'm sorry, I might switch between two languages, which I've started doing more often. सवाल जो है वो बहुत, जब सवाल आए तब सवाल बहुत ही मुश्किल थे मेरे लिए, और मैंने ये सोचा कि इन सवालों के ऊपर सवाल करे जाए तो बदतमीज़ी होती है, बिकॉज़ यही आपको पढ़ाया गया कि सवाल पे सवाल नहीं किया जाता. तो सवाल पे अगर सवाल नहीं होगा तो फिर किस तरीके से उसको जवाब दिया जाए या उसको किस तरीके से मैं उसके ऊपर बात कर सकूं, ये मैं सोचे जा रहा था. एंड आई हैव मेरे पास कुछ किस्से हैं और कुछ अपनी राइटिंग्स फाइंडिंग्स हैं जो अपने काम के थ्रू मैं समझ पाया हूँ अर्बनिज़म के बारे में. आर्किटेक्चर का बैकग्राउंड बैचलर्स का डजंट रियली क्वालिफाई फॉर गिविंग यू enough information on what urbanism means or can be or can become. But life does. I mean, when you live in a city or if you live in cities If you travel in cities but don't travel as a tourist, but travel as a person who would want to engage with the city, then you get to learn a lot about what urbanity means. The first thing I want to read out, and I'm going to read it out, is from a really very, very nice book that has recently come out, and I'm not trying to sell the book. The Forgotten Cities of Delhi by Rana Zafri. उसमें एक बहुत ही बताऊंगा क्यों. In the posh bungalows surrounding Delhi's Hos Khas area, there is a very strange monument, which to me resembles a lighthouse. The strangeness comes from the fact that Delhi is a landlocked city with no sign of the ocean for miles. However, this monument seems to have a darker side to it. One has to go into our block of Hos Khas residential area, where there are 2 iron gates on the way. Most of the guards in the area will guide you to it, as there is no signage. Once we go closer to the board, do we read that it's Chor Minar, built by Sultan Alauddin Khilji. And it was used to exhibit the severed heads of thieves during his reign. As per the legend, it has 225 holes. The purpose of this minaret was to strike terror in the hearts of people, enough to make every sinner turn into a saint. And obviously those 225 holes were all about hanging those heads by whatever hook there might have been. However, no reference is found for this monument in any contemporary text, and we can only reach this conclusion based on Sultan's reputation for cruelty and severity. Khilji, now comes the important part. Khilji came to the throne of Delhi Sultanate at a time when the Mongol threat was escalating, and he had to maintain a huge army. He could not therefore afford mismanagement, inflation, cheating and deceit, which would prevent him from facing that threat from a position of strength and power. This may seem barbaric now, but was probably the norm in those times for rulers aiming to run a streamlined administration. I found it very exciting. I thought this was installation art, even though installation is such a poor word to be included in fine art. I mean, what is installation? It was interesting, and suddenly makes imagination run wild, at least for me. What it connects to, and of course there's, I won't want to do that, but there was a wonderful small nazm by a famous poet, but let's not get into that. Now comes my notes, which I want to connect with this. Today the city is without a body and therefore rendered transparent. Whatever is transparent has no shadow and therefore no mystery, no secrets, no aura. Then how will this transparent city reinvent itself? A city, as we know, is a complex system that relies on individuals who are constantly changing. Such a dynamic system can never be in a state of equilibrium. And if it were to reach equilibrium, it would cease to exist. In order for it to live on, it must permit for marvelous places for surprise. Now, Khilji's monument was, for me, a place surprise. It kind of, for whatever it did, for whatever it stood for at that time, it made me think about, that led me to think about spatiality. I'm going on broader concepts. I'm not going with what is wrong right now, because as I said, सवाल पे सवाल ही निकल रहे थे, कुछ जवाब नहीं आ पा रहे थे. With spatiality, what I wanted to, bring to the table is, in recent times, have given to occupy a very different meaning. It no longer refers to space we live in. Social behaviors, especially those that are not easily categorized, are never really structured into urban spaces. This means that ways of using such spaces can change if we were to include new layered experiences and zones, where actors in those spaces could become responsible for production of that space. And that links to, let's say, the performers, the street performers and their absence. The erasure of hard categories, which has been happening for quite some time. The erasure of hard categories could lengthen the lifespan of such spaces, enabling them to occupy a wider diversity where a community could emerge. Word community keeps coming back a lot in architecture and urbanism. But when I go back to Baap Dada ki Zaban and I say I replace community with biradari, that completely takes on a new wonderful aspect. And then we start looking at urbanism from a very different point of view, like my nani now. My nani's side comes from Sitaram Bazar. Now Sitaram Dar at some point established Sitaram Bazar, which still is a part of Old Delhi. And to that woman, Sheher was always that place. It was never New Delhi. It was almost interesting to see that they would think of New Delhi as some suburban sort of space. It was never Sheher. And that organic urbanity that existed still exists. It hasn't gone away, which kind of keeps making me think about spatiality constantly. There are two very important pieces that I wanted to bring to the table. One was a conversation, a very small note from a book called A Winter's Journey, and it's about 4 conversations that Marianne Brausch has with Paul Virelio. And these conversations happened in 1999. The reason why I'm bringing them up is also its timing and talking about space. And 99, and then there is a follow-up in 2000. Virelio says about geographical location and social bond, and I think the idea of social bond, or that phrase of social bond, becomes very important when one looks at the questions that are posed by Ashish. So Virelio says, the place of settlement underpins the unit of settlement. If tribes were made up of hundreds of persons, if extended families consisted of 30 to 50, that's because they lived on a territory and roamed around it. They were not tied to one, because tied to one restricted environment. The more the place of settlement became structured and developed through villages, towns, metropolises, megalopolises, or metacities, the more the unit of population, the family, dissolved. We have here a phenomena of the unity of human beings that's linked to urbanism and architecture, not to the urbanism in the sense that Le Corbusier or other theorists would talk about, but to urbanism as a major historical and political phenomenon. And he does say that the city, in his view, is a major political phenomenon, a political form of history itself. What I wanted to counter that with, in 99 he says this, of course he's talking about probably a decade older ideas, a fantastic, mad, completely off his rocker artist, who doesn't want to call himself artist, is Vito Acconci. I don't know how many of you would have heard of Vito Acconci, but Vito Acconci does many things, not just one. And in the year 2000, the Venice Biennale held a very interesting sub-biennale, which was only online. And all major architects and urban designers published their views and essays on urbanism to come in this new century in that online biennale. And Vito Acconci was the only one who stuck out for me, because he said, his one quote was particularly quite interesting. He said, a computer makes a city seem unnecessary. If you can, all the information on the city, if you can have all the information on the city in front of you on a computer, you don't need the actual city. Now, something of that nature we are sensing now, a Zomato app, or places where we don't really need to go any longer to, and we can access the city through the mobile phone, which has now become a kind of a computer. It is a computer. It has a processor. It's a very powerful tool. And I thought this was very interesting because it sharply adjusted itself with what Virelio was talking about. Location, social bond, and the mobile phone completely destroys that. But it somehow also links to the idea that unit, what will now become as a qualifying unit for what the city would be made up of. The last bit is interesting, but I think I can come back to it. these were my thoughts. These were my thoughts that I wanted to bring to the table. For me, I need to understand a city through its unit. If I know the unit, then I would know how the city would work and how it can readjust itself whenever it needs to readjust itself. Now, if we qualify compassion, equity, and what was that other lovely word? Ethics. I think these need to be reevaluated. I mean, I actually don't have a view on these words any longer, because I don't see people having a view on these words any longer. And I think these are real troubled times that at least I'm facing. As an artist, I can say that I'm useless, so I can think of all those things. That might not be applicable to the Zaheen bunch sitting on this side. But as an artist, I can get away, and I don't want to get away with it. But the thing is that it troubles me. It troubles me that I do not find ethics in practices any longer of any kind, and I don't find compassion in people. And I don't know how to even engage with that, because that ultimately makes or breaks a city, or a community, or a biradri, or whatever you may call it, from whichever unit point you might be looking at. So, yes, cultural enterprise should take over the city. I absolutely agree with that. There is no other way of looking at it. But how, I don't know.
I think thank you for your presentation, provocation, whatever. I don't want to make any further remarks. I think the what's been offered by the panelists is really substantive enough to evoke a pretty good discussion and informed discussion. Therefore, I'll ask for questions from the audience. Please take a mic and identify yourself, and then raise your question. The mic will reach you in a minute.
My name is Yogesh, and real nice perspective by all the three speakers. The point I wanted to check from Swati and Ratish. Yogesh, resident, member of Habitat and resident of Nizamuddin. Swati, I had the privilege of going down to the flower market multiple times. For all the travel we do to global cities, the engagement of events and cultural programs happening at monuments is such a done thing. Ratish, you mentioned that we've created this beautiful space on the nursery, and the fact you got amphitheaters, etc. But if you look at Nehru Park, right from October to March, you have jazz concerts, music concerts. If you look at the current government, the Central Park and CP, every weekend, there were festivals in Kabir. So the fact that they already have a template by which so much is happening, and in recent times they opened up this park in called the Park of Seven Wonders near Kale Khan, and they're doing cultural activities there as well. So I just wanted to understand that what stops replicating a template which is already being done in a few neighborhoods. And Swati, the fact that there used to be a flower market and it's now moved, what stops creating a theme or a festival and then going to ensure that you recreate and continue with it? Because what I seem to see is that certain places it happens, and anybody who wants to replicate it comes back saying too many approvals, and yet it's happening, right? So how can we just build up on that? And the fact, I just wanted to highlight, Ratish, this new space they created, which was on Ring Road. They had 10,000 people coming in every weekend. It was such a parking nightmare that the expressway. So this nice space that you've created, have you considered with the museum coming and Sundar Nursery, is there elaborate parking there? Because otherwise that's going to be another challenge in the future.
Before we, do you think, panelists, that it'd be a good idea to take 2 or 3 questions and then answer them, so that the audience gets properly engaged? We'll take about 3 and then, please.
May I?
Yes.
My name is Kartar Hemrajani. I'm an engineer. I've been a resident of Delhi all these 70 years, my age that is. I've also lived in Kidwainagar before this new restoration thing, and in Bombay before, and I've seen how Bombay has gone down the drain completely, and how parts of Delhi have also been doing that. And this Kidwainagar project, for example, I think if you gentlemen would know far better, but I've been inside because I live there. It's a total disaster. I mean, there's just concrete, and whatever trees used to be there have always been cut down. And I would say that the profession of architects and town planners over the years, now is changing, have not been vocal enough about the destruction that was being wrought in Delhi in the name of development. Thank you.
You addressing the question to a particular panelist or all of us?
No, I'm just saying
All
the
of
rest, the profession. As
Okay,
such.
all right.
You know, I'm a member of the Habitat Center. I've worked with architects, so I know.
Good evening. Thank you so much for these wonderful deliberations. I thought there was a tremendous variety in the way that Vishal spoke about more theoretical issues, and Ratish and Swati spoke about the more specifics. To comment on this notion of Sheher, Sitaram Bazar, etc., you know, for those people who came between 41 and 51, Nizamuddin actually became not outside or on the suburbs. I also grew up there. My parents and grandparents came from Pakistan. So Nizamuddin acquired a life, and we have seen over the decades what happened to Humayun's tomb. It went to seed, and then the way started picking up because of the wonderful foundation that you represent today. I've also seen very carefully the different stages of the restoration, because I love the place, and of Sundar Nasri, which I have examined very closely in the last few months. It is an amazing way to resurrect and create a lung for the city, the way that you have done, Sundar Nasri. But you know, you said that it's now got all these other, it's accessible in so many other ways. So I wanted to say that by putting a ticket there of 40-45 rupees, I don't know, okay, so I don't know how easy it is for bringing groups of children, youth, which I tried to do because I work for a youth NGO. And even to go and buy plants is so bureaucratic. So I don't know about the access anymore. Then there's this farmer's market, which of course sells everything at astronomical prices. So has it become this little nice niche hangout for all of us who are trying to think of a central park? It's actually much less accessible than Nehru Park and the other places that this gentleman spoke about. Your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Well, there isn't an immediate raising of hands, so may I suggest that the panelists take their turns to answer. Who wants to begin?
To respond to the first gentleman, and you were talking about why can't these templates be replicated? I think my response, my question would be, so who will be the primary actors? Who creates these spaces again? And I think that's what we need to be talking about in terms of our roles and responsibilities as architects and citizens. I think when a group of people are actively removed, it's very difficult for another group, you know, from a similar sort of background to be able to create similar spaces. I mean, just as an example, a distant example, many of the homeless people you see on the streets are really victims of multiple evictions. So once you've been evicted several times, you know, it just street seems the safest sort of space. So I think we are sending out a certain message by state-sponsored actions, which I think weakens people, weakens communities. I would like to say that communities are resilient, but I think that would be untrue. Because I think every time they come back, but even in the case of, I think near Mehroli, I think now there is a market which has come up near Qutub Minar. So, you know, communities are resilient, they do come back, but I think every time they come back, they are weakened further. So I think that has to be kept in mind. And I think just as an opportunity to kind of ride on this question, I also wanted to point out that these spaces, the way our city is being restructured, reshaped, which is what I was talking about, is not just, I think, we can't just blame technocrats or policymakers or lawmakers alone. I think we're all complicit in it. And I think the sort of biases, notions of class and caste that we all carry, the public, I think, psyche is instrumental in shaping the city, as it is today. So I think there I sort of, deviate a bit from the questions and the brief. So I think that, that's my response to what you were saying. And in Kidwai Nagar, I completely, I think there are so many better models of urban development, urban planning, which are possible. Sorry?
Didn't happen overnight, went on for 7 years when all the disaster was taking place.
Yeah, and it's called, I think, zero waste, zero carbon sort of a project. So it's definitely not the model that we want to emulate. Not the sort of urban planning projects that we want to be creating further, but somehow these are the norm now.
I just want to add to that. There is both the points are connected in somewhat in some manner where we have to question what is the how does the citizen own up, and how does the citizen mobilize himself or herself? It can't be just about RWAs. I mean, they became a fascist sort of space all by itself. I remember going into a colony, being screamed at just because I parked the car, which is free land to park on. Suddenly everyone becomes, Delhi is also very strange. I never call it a city. I've grown up in it. I mean, both Padaish, Rahash is Delhi. But the problem with Delhi is that Delhi is very provincial. It is like that. Delhi is not just the areas that we've discussed. I mean, I grew up partly first 12 years Delhi Cant. Then I grew up in Arkepuram. But then growing up in Delhi Cant made me get access to West Delhi, because a large catchment of my friends were coming from West Delhi. I discovered West Delhi. Through West Delhi, I discovered North Delhi, because I went to Anand Vihar to meet friends. So I had to go through West Delhi to go and see them in North Delhi. I didn't go the other route. I didn't even for the longest didn't know about Rajpur Road, the posh areas of North Delhi. So Delhi is actually quite an expanded, organic, strange city, and it really doesn't behave like a city. It's I can't even make sense of it any longer. I don't know what Delhi is. I mean, if you were to question me, I wouldn't. And I think the point of ownership is very important. Like, how do citizens even cultivate ownership? And it's very interesting that these points come up. They are questions that go on in my head also. And I remembered very interesting incident that Faiz Ahmad Faiz comes to Bombay, and a young poet says, आप नज़में तो बहुत अच्छी लिखते हैं, but जब पढ़ते हैं तो वो मज़ा नहीं आता है. तो he said, अब सब मैं ही करूँ, तुम भी तो कुछ करो. You know, it's very interesting. Somebody else also. I mean, you can question, but how are we going to take ownership? It's the burning question. I mean, we are going to see monstrosity after monstrosity, and it's going to keep going on. So, what's your thought on that?
Gosh. Yeah, I mean, I could totally agree with you. I don't think anybody looks at Delhi as one city, and the flip side of that is, with 3 different municipalities, it's really become, and the NDMC and the Cantonment Board, it's become several cities, which I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, I would prefer it being governed in a more city-state kind of manner, but it's not. Yogesh, to answer your question, the festivals you talk about are often organized by the government, and 2 different rules apply. So you don't need the same permissions, and it just doesn't make sense to have a function in the Chaussat Khamba in Nizamuddin or the amphitheater in Sundar Nursery and yet have a fire engine on standby. But every time we do that, and it's and a lot of these festivals that you're talking about in Nehru Park are organized by event organizers, big event organizers. It doesn't allow artists to just come and sort of, pay a small fees and just do their performance. I mean, we had one-day festival organized almost impromptu by the Ministry of Tourism, and they spent 1 crore on one day. You'll be shocked at what the funding for example, the Jahan Khusro is. It's hell of a lot of money, and a lot of big teams working towards doing this. So what we were talking about is more impromptu sort of thing. You can't just go to, say, Gandak ki Bauli and have a small street performance. You'll be kicked out of there in no time. So that's the problem. Parking is an issue. It's at issue at Sundar Nursery as much as it's an issue at Humayun's Tomb. It's landlocked. We just yesterday I've written another long letter to look at some portions of land that are encroached. But really the only way forward is, and we're in touch with the Delhi Tourism, Delhi government, to look at feeder buses from the different metro stations. That is the only hope. Otherwise it's always going to be a problem. We have built additional parking for 400 cars. No, it's all on level because there's archaeology and all of that. So your question, ma'am, I mentioned the Afghan because I was quite surprised that the large Afghan families are choosing to pay for a ticket rather than go to Lodi Gardens free of cost. And they're coming even today. There was a large group of Afghan families. I know the sale of plants is complicated, but we have nothing to do with it. It's the CPWD who now insists that they have to get a card payment. But do you know how much money the CPWD makes selling plants at Sundar Nursery every year? Do you have any idea? Can anybody guess? Anybody buys plants at Sundar Nursery?
Yes.
How much money does the Sundar Nursery make in selling plants to people like ourselves every year?
They still charge less than other nurseries.
Fine, so how much money do they make?
As a consumer, it's
20 lakhs.
They actually lose 7 crores. It's taxpayers' money. Why should the government lose 7 crores every year in selling plants? I don't know. Obviously, you benefit because you're getting something which is bought at half the price. Why the government should be doing that? I don't know. But that's a separate story altogether. Why 20 acres in the heart of Delhi should be a plant nursery? I don't know. When coming to the fees, one of our objectives at Sundar Nursery, the 35 rupee ticket, and if you're a regular user, you can buy a pass for 3,000 rupees for the whole year, and if you're plus 60, then it's 2,000 rupees. We're also trying to introduce family passes. We're trying to introduce, one of the big problems that has happened is when the Humayun's Tomb ticket has become 600 rupees, is that India is losing out all the backpackers. You know, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, all backpacked through India. None of those backpackers are now coming in because of ticket prices. So we, the reason I was so confident in sort of saying let's do street performances at Sundar Nursery is because we've taken to manage Sundar Nursery. None of the money that we've put into Sundar Nursery is recovered from any ticket sales. And no money into maintenance of Sundar Nursery comes from the government. So it's every penny of tickets or whatever is spent is actually plowed back into keeping it clean, secure, green. And we have added 300 tree species. We continue to do so. So it's a small sum to pay, and it's specially kept low. And with Humayun's Tomb ticket, it's going to be even lower. But essentially, it's basically 2 bottles of water that you're paying for. It doesn't pay for anything. The payment, the only way Sundar Nursery or any public space will become sustainable and not dependent on government funds is going to happen when you do a lot of activities and so on. The Central Park in New York is 700 acres. It is managed by the Central Park Conservancy and not by the City of New York, but the City of New York gives some $2 billion every year to the Central Park Conservancy. We're not taking that money. We're trying to demonstrate a model where a public space can be sustainably managed financially and to a high international standard. But we can talk about it endless. I do realize that people who've been coming to Sundar Nursery for many years pinch that 35 rupees, however little it might be, pinches. But I can only assure you it's going to a good cause.
Just to respond to Vishal, you were talking about at an individual level, what can we possibly do? And I think, and also as you pointed out, we already are doing something. The RWAs, for instance, you know, every time I've realized, well, most of the times there's an eviction of a basti. It's because a complaint has been made by neighboring RWA. Even the flower markets were relocated. It started with a complaint filed by someone who lives in Connaught Place. So I think we are actively, actually, I think taking these, making these decisions and taking these actions. So what can we do to kind of change this sort of narrative that few people have taken the initiative to build is again to the rest of us who perhaps disagree with that narrative. And I really believe in just taking to the streets. When the 16,000
Sorry. These days, they don't go to the streets. They sign on change.org.
I mean,
Those days are gone, you know.
But I think whatever works, even that, I think, step is important because that leads to, sorry?
Look at Hong Kong. These days are
Exactly.
Yeah,
It starts somewhere.
Yeah.
When the
Good for Hong Kong.
we will find out, I guess. But yeah, I mean, that is important. That sort of mobilization is important. When the 16,000 trees, the felling of 16,000 trees was an issue, you saw so many people, you know, gathered and they were protests. So we have something to learn from our environmental activists because when neighborhood is razed to the ground, there are no protests. When the Hall of Nations was demolished, we couldn't mobilize ourselves to protest. So clearly, I mean, there is something that needs to be learned from some people who are able to mobilize such protests. And I really believe in just being able to gather ourselves. And even if it starts from a Facebook post, even if it starts from change.org, I think it starts somewhere. And then words become actions. I strongly believe in that. I mean, it's a small step, but it makes a difference. Secondly, I also think it's important for us to be working with the government, working within the so-called system. I think not always kind of being the activist on the street, but also engaging with these processes that we disagree with so much. And also, I think taking on roles that we are uncomfortable with or just sort of disciplines that are very different from ours. So if lawyers actually start designing, if engineers become poets or artists, I think those are the kind of intermediate spaces we need to create. And I think those are I mean, that's where perhaps this change is possible.
Should we ask, yes, for more questions? Yeah, great.
Yeah, good evening. I'll introduce myself as a disgruntled citizen of Delhi because we are the faceless masses. Nobody bothers about us. You know, you're talking of improvement of Delhi cultural things. In Delhi, we don't even have basic roads and footpaths. Every government that comes, there's so much wastage of money. If anybody drives around Delhi, you will see the footpath is made and remade within 6 months. It is something they forgot to put or they are deliberately doing it. I think everybody must be seeing that in Delhi. There is no drainage system. Every year it rains, but no minister or no MP will address it. They get crores of rupees for development of their colonies. I have attended an RWA meeting and the president says very proudly, I have convinced our councillor that he is going to do this new thing. It is our right, I think, and we have to beg them for it. So I think all these discussions will not lead anywhere. We are talking of your house is leaking, your sofa, the springs are out, and you're talking of beautification that I want to put flowers. How is it going to help us? Please tell us.
Questions, because these questions are really the fuel for all of us. Here, and there's Olga has a question.
Good afternoon, Olga Shepelyanskaya, founder of Unicity. We work on placemaking and heritage revival in Asian cities. So I have two questions. First goes to Vishal. So first, thank you very much for your insights. It's quite unusual to hear such kind of approaches, and it was very stimulating for me to hear them. So I'd like to dwell on one of them. When you mentioned that today, through our computer, we can access all the different facilities which we needed to attend physically before. So on one side, we have this situation where, in fact, we can avoid stepping out. On the other side, what I'm seeing in Indian cities, people don't seem to have the necessity to dwell into public spaces, feel comfortable in them. They kind of follow their way, they cross through to reach a destination, and this is where they do whatever they need, and then they go back. And now, in addition, this device is there. I would like to understand a bit better, if you can enlighten me. What would be a way of interacting with urban public spaces which would be anchored in the Indian culture? Because when you look at traditional Indian ancient cities, everything was designed in such a way that people would have natural shade, you know, with special architectural features, you know, which would protect them against the sun, against the rain. There would be some public squares. Obviously, that's a typical heritage feature. It would be human scale, so you are at eyesight. So all that was making people comfortable. And in fact, India is one of the few Asian countries which still wants low rise. When you look at it, many Asian countries have accepted to grow high, but in India there is still kind of resistance towards that. But at the same time, people seem to be so indifferent to their urban environment that I have hardly seen it in any other country. So from your knowledge of history and culture, literature, what would you say, where maybe can we dig the Indian roots to bring it back, to maybe reconsider how we approach cities today in India? And the second question I have, that is to other panelists, to Swati and Ratish. So I know that Delhi has tried, I don't know where it stands now, it tried to become a World Heritage City. It was preparing the application. So now a major issue that I see with Delhi is that, and that in fact is the case in all Indian cities as well, there are pockets. So what we talk about when we talk about place making, there is one pocket in which you can come and enjoy the space. But then as soon as you step out, it's a completely disrupted urban fabric. You don't know where to step, there is chaos. But yet if we take at least the south of Delhi part, it was designed in such a way that, you know, there are proper pedestrian paths, etc. So I feel that maybe even it's not so costly to kind of, it's more behavior, kind of an intervention where you can reactivate and make the urban fabric more user-friendly, which then would suddenly uplift the city to a whole different level, because pockets is not something that you enjoy if you want to have the experience of the city. So I'd like to know, is there anything that, at least is it on the agenda? And if it is, then what are the plans of the city to kind of activate again the urban fabric? Thank you.
Sorry, did I understand that you had a problem with cows?
Not only.
Better keep it in. There was a question in the, two questions more at the back. Were there?
Hello, hi, I'm Nitin. I research and write about the regional ecology of Delhi. So I'm a bit biased in my question, sorry for that. I was wondering, just like how Vishal talked about his grandmother, like we all just talk about Delhi, you know, like, but because the title of the panel is 100 years of sort of revisiting or reimagining Delhi, no? So in the 1960s, of course, something really drastic happened. For the first time, it became actually a regional city, and it was designed as a regional city, and it keeps growing. If you keep going from here to Chandigarh, you find as if it's just one city sort of rolled out, and same in the south and east and west. So I was just wondering, like, what the panel thinks about, like, are there any responses about like this cultural enterprise rolling out with the city, rolling out hundreds of miles as well, you know, like where do you see potentialities? What do you see? Is there some sort of like hopeful ecology there, or is it just hopeless and sort of, you know, we should accept the fate and just live with it? So I would like your insights on that.
There's one more question at the back. Was there?
I'm M.B. Chandra from Delhi University. The question is regarding this. Delhi is the capital of India, and you are talking about World Heritage City and all. 70% of Delhi's residential accommodation is unauthorized. Every government promises to make it authorized, but nothing has been done. Even this government has promised, but it is nowhere near. This has come out by promising with corrupt government practices, vote bank in mind, and such dwellings have come up. So you're talking about 100 years and all. It is a capital city, and the situation is still prevailing in such a scenario. So could you throw some light on that?
Great, thank you. Now, these are what 4 questions we have, and one of the questioners has left. You wanted to, I did too say something, but she's left. That's all right. That's the whole point about the urban condition. It's we can. I'm sure the others will not mind hear it.
I was
So-
just going to tell her to stop paying taxes. You just stop paying taxes. Oh, I mean that. Olga had a question for me, so I'll do that very quickly. I do have a problem with this tagline phrase of Indian culture. I don't understand it, but I don't understand it because it varies from region to region, mile to mile. But I do understand what you're asking me. I do think that the North, more of that was found in, let's say, Gujarat and Rajasthan than in Delhi. Delhi is a very strange city. It has a bit of a lot. It is not entirely. It hasn't emerged all by itself. It has a lot of add-ons being brought into it. It's a patchwork. And that's one of the problems that I've always had with the city. It's also it's spread and these sections which define the east, the west, the north, the south, and the central, and then the Shahjahanabad, the old side. Each section is actually a city all by itself. The problem of the point A to point B is because of that. When I remember growing up, and I don't want to keep going back into that mode, but friends and families from West Delhi had nothing to do with South Delhi. They didn't even come to South Delhi. They would come to Central Delhi, but they wouldn't come to South Delhi. They had nothing to do in South Delhi. South Delhi didn't have anything to do in South Delhi. South Delhi would want to go to Central Delhi. Central Delhi was essentially the hub for Delhi. North had its own, because of the university, it had its own space, so to say, that it had carved out. Growing up, I never understood the city. I really didn't. Once when I went to Jerusalem and I went through the souks, I said, oh, this looks like a market in Lajpat Nagar. So maybe we got it from there. You know, you start patching things. Even in Istanbul this time when I was there, I said, parts of it look like what I grew up seeing as market spaces. So I am not really sure of that part of how to get a cultural identity into the city, if I understand the question correctly. If it is about getting a cultural identity into the city, making the city function better culturally. No, it was, I mean, even growing up years, I remember it was a very difficult city to acknowledge public spaces. You wouldn't be sitting outside. It just didn't happen. Only in the winters would one want to go to these Buddha Jayanti parks and the Nehru parks, at least for me who stayed on this side of the city. The public spaces were not really relevant. Cinema halls were. Huh? No, even if you keep going back, people were having a very bad time. My grandmother tells me times which are very troublesome growing up in that heat and that winter, because it used to have a bad summer. I mean, Delhi used to have a very bad summer and a very bad winter. So people dying of hemorrhages because there were not there were no fans at that time. There was not enough electricity supply. Anyways, what what one does want to talk about is those missing pockets. Where are those missing pockets and why are they not included in city planning? South Delhi developed quite interestingly. I saw that part develop. South Extension comes as a public-private partnership. The whole of South Extension. DLF. So did Rajouri Garden. Rajouri Garden was the first public-private partnership, I guess. That was all farmlands, one would remember. That between South Delhi and West Delhi, there was nothing but farmlands. And then you say, oh, the city kind of compressed and coagulated or mutated to become, two parts became one, where they were not one. So I don't know, I mean, one has to study a lot more and go back to those decades possibly, the 60s and the 70s, and start looking at how master planning was being organized, how private partnerships were being brought in. Then you have Alaknanda being the last development that comes up somewhere in the late 80s. Vasant Kunj comes up when TVB is there. There is no Vasant, I mean, Vasant Kunj is kind of coming up. In the 80s, Vasant Kunj comes up. It's very sparse. I went to Shishant School of Architecture, Art and Architecture. There was no highway. There were cows on the highway, what you see as highway today. And I'm talking about mid-90s. It's not even that far back. It's interesting how this city has kind of changed shape, and it constantly does that. About Vito Conchi's thing, I'm not saying that I subscribe to that idea, but it's a very powerful idea. That how does a city start vanishing? How does physicality start vanishing when you become virtual, or yourself starts becoming virtual? Turning the city into a car city actually also does a virtual twist to it, because now you're zipping past places you don't even know. Now with the new highway, the flyovers, the Vasant Vihar flyover, you zip and you completely skip the entire Vasant Vihar. Malay Mandir was a landmark. Now it's missed. It was on the top of a hill. Now it's lower. So it's interesting that devices and technologies will transform the city as well. It's not just about other aspects of urbanity.
I actually come in at this point because I think the issues raised here are kind of fundamental to understanding, and they have to do with understanding the city. What do we understand is actually the urban condition, you know. And what has happened to my, I'll tell you a very simple thing, because this whole issue about public space, why is there no concept of public space? It may be described in many abstract theoretical terms, but a very practical suggestion or insight about that was given to me by somebody no less than a member of Delhi Urban Art Commission, who said that, you know, all our rules, planning controls, have to do, bylaws, building bylaws, have to do within the plot boundary. They only specify conditions within the plot boundary. So in a way, the laws have forced us to engage with the city only within a plot. So there is no public space which is actually acknowledged by the planning authorities. Now, this is a complete, it's like a forgotten thing. And I've been working in Delhi for a long time, and I also didn't really quite realize the importance of this. There is, of course, only one person I know in the profession who has researched into this very rigorously, and he happens to be an engineer, a very old man now, living in Bombay. He was part of the team with Charles Correa for the design of New Bombay, Shirish Patel, along with Charles and along with Praveena. The three of them worked on the plan, which was a long time ago. And Shirish is the only one who has systematically, like a good engineer, examined the notion of public space in terms of planning controls. An article which you can refer to, anyone is interested in, appeared in the EPW in 2007, I think, which is the beginning of a series of articles that he has written since then. But I think he's become rather old, he's kind of run out of steam now. But, and so the publicness has somehow been taken away from the public by the authorities. Also, what this has shown us is that the city itself is, as has been pointed out in some of the discussion, is not a single entity. Traditionally, ancient cities were always seen as a place which could be perceived by a human being, and that was before the motor car. Today, you cannot perceive the city. I mean, you don't even need the virtual realm. The motor car, as you also pointed out, has actually given us a way of making the city invisible. So but the point of hope is that I want to bring back to one of the question which I think has been at the core of this entire discussion, or should be, is the question of ownership. Who owns the city? We still have the urban neighborhood. You will find all over Delhi urban neighborhoods which are still to a walking scale. And that is the hope of the city. But those neighborhoods cannot be planned by the planners. And this is also a sign of great hope. Because they have to be worked upon, engaged by the citizen. So I have now for 20 years been living in I've said this in this forum before also, in a neighborhood which I consider to be an independent republic. No laws operate there. We make our own laws. It's called Ayanagar. It's the last village of Delhi on the Marali-Gurgaon road. It is notorious amongst the authorities as a place for unauthorized construction, and basically it's a old Gujar village. And the Gujar headman said to me when I went to live there, he said, what is this? Who is this government? We were here long before this so-called government. क्या है सरकार ये? कहाँ से आई? ये तो हमारी ज़मीन है, हम तो यहाँ रहते हैं, हमारे पुरख के सारे यहीं रहते हैं. So we will do what we like, and they do it. You know, and everybody is complicit in this kind of. So this is of course a huge story. I'm not going to go into this, but the fact is that it is, in fact, the whole reason for this forum, Architecture and Society, is that we wish citizens to address the city. We've got to reclaim the city in whatever way we can perceive it. And we have to, and there are so many ways. This is the nice thing about any large collection of human beings living in close contiguity to each other, is that there are so many different points of view. And that is what makes life in the city attractive, really. It isn't just the amenities. It isn't just the roads and the footpaths and the drainage and the sewage, which is not existent, I agree. It's frightful what's going on. But even in spite of that, what is going to make the city attractive is this conviviality, is the fact that, and you raise these issues out of the paper, that the small brief written, that it is issues like ethics and compassion, which we have to address, and we can only address them as human beings. So, while living in Ayanagar, I realized that, a settlement had been made by citizens. And since then, the flag I'm flying is urban renewal by citizens. It's no longer a question of asking them to participate. Experts in urban development have been talking for 20, 30 years that people must participate in planning. Who are you to ask people to participate? The right belongs to the people. It doesn't belong to the authorities. And the authorities have to realize that and actually it's happening, because as somebody pointed out quite rightly, 75% by official statistics, 75% of Delhi's population is unplanned. 75%. This statistic was based on a very rigorous research done with huge funding, and which was till 2 years ago. So it's five over the last 5 years. So it's old. By now, the 75% may have become 80% already. This is official. There are 8 types of settlements which are catalogued by the government. Out of them, 7 are so-called informal, which is only, and 1 is planned out of 8. And these 7, and you may call informal, is a meaningless term. It means that they're not planned. They're outside the plan. So you see, we have many wonderful realities in this city, and I think it's up to the citizens to actually to engage. So I think the points that you are raising, I mean, Swati, you started the discussion very well with this point, and I think we've all, I mean, Ratish, of course, has come in and shown how a public agency can actually address these issues in a very specific and extremely organized manner, structured and methodical, systematic, which in the long run is helpful to the public because the public can engage. And, you know, so I just wanted to make this intervention before it's too late and everybody leaves. I think the issue is that how do we take ownership of the city? It has been pointed out by people in discussion. And I think this is the central point. Thank you.
Just going to respond to Olga's thing. I don't know what is the World Heritage status. I was never involved, so I don't know much about it. But fortunately or unfortunately, I think the situation today is that there can be only pockets of influence. Nizamuddin Basti is not very big, and we've been working there for over a decade. But even then, even the whole Basti is not our pocket of influence. We might be doing streets, we might benefit 99.9% of the people, but from an urban intervention, there are only pockets in Nizamuddin that we've been able to do something serious at. I mean, I don't think there will ever be, I think we in India need to be more concerned about what is happening to our cities rather than what they once were. I think we need to be more concerned about the quality of life of our people than try to achieve something that will get World Heritage status. Having said that, Ahmedabad and more recently Jaipur have both got World Heritage status, and I think both of them are not in any ways deserving of that status. It's happened because of politics at the highest level and all of that. It's not that anything great about these cities anymore, or anything great is left in these cities.
I'm just hoping for more provocations from the audience. Sorry, just.
The lady left.
Yeah, I think most of the people who have asked the questions have left. Nitin, if you want to, I don't know, maybe add to your question. I'm not really sure how to answer that. Like, what's the sort of cultural enterprise on that peripheral, I think, parts of our cities could imagine, right? I think maybe there is, there's scope for a reimagination at the periphery. So if you want to add something there, please feel free. Anyone else who wants to add to this discussion, you're welcome. I think it would make it more interesting. Go ahead, Nitin.
For example, Dwarka Expressway is a very good case in point, no? Like, I don't know if anyone has been on Dwarka Expressway ever, but I really invite all of you to go there to really see what kind of cities we are building, you know? Like, I mean, what we're talking about are relics, like things that have been planned in the past. But what are we planning at the moment, or what are the sort of cities we are building at the moment? It's really scary, you know? Like, it's, I mean, there's sort of like a social splintering at a scale that we've never seen. So, like, condominiums one after the other with no public spaces at all. So, I mean, and people living in condominiums don't care who lives outside, what happens outside. So what kind of cultural enterprise would we talk about 5 years from now or 10 years from now, you know? So that's something I sort of turn in bed when I go to sleep at night and sort of like really wonder about, you know, like, okay, I mean, all these nice spaces in South Delhi or like centers of our cities, but what happens outside where there's not even a space which can be called public apart from the street and the footpath, of course, if footpath is there. So yeah, I mean, what kind of, I'm just wondering, like, the only hopeful case in my opinion, and it's debatable, was the Aravali Biodiversity Park, you know, like, which was quite a big, and they're fighting now against the road that's coming through the park, and they're fighting for the ecology and the scraping of PLPA Act, for example, you know. So I mean,
in my opinion, the hopeful side there was they found something that was sort of laying unclaimed, and they said, okay, we're gonna occupy this and do something about it. So yeah, I'm just sort of like passing the ball back, because I think there's more brains there and more sort of like sides there. Sorry, who should I pass? Okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Rike. I'm since 3 years here in Delhi, mainly working also in different informal areas. And what I would like to understand a bit more in detail, because you mentioned now participation is not really needed from the municipality side. And I think it's a critical statement, like how do we define participation? What do we mean? When can it come from within, and when is it rather imposed? I think it's more or less for everybody. Like also in Nizamuddin, like was it coming from outside? Was it coming from inside? And how can we say, and how can we also bring it together with ethics and compassion? And how do you define ethics and compassion? So yeah, I think it's connected also what you said. Do we really have different pockets, and do we want to connect the pockets, or do we want to keep the pockets, or can we break them up? Or how do we build this kind of identity, or do we want to build it?
Shall we take one or two more questions and then we'll, yeah, here. Okay, there's one in the back, then we'll come to you.
Hi, I'm Ayush. I'm a young architect, been all my life in Delhi. And the thing that bothers me the most is unorganized and unplanned development. Like the RTR flyover you talked about wasn't necessary. The time taken from Arkepuram to the airport was merely 15-20 minutes before the flyover. Now it takes about 40-45 minutes. When I try to go to Gurgaon, the roads are so haphazardly planned that you can't reach your destination without constantly looking at your phone. So where does that take a city? And how does unorganized, basically what's happening in Paharganj and Mayapuri? They've shut down the shops, they've shut down the industries, but they've got nowhere to go. So we need to take out spaces for someone to go before, shutting down things in the city, please.
Can I add one more thing? Hi, I am Harshal, and I'm an architect and an urban planner. And I just want to add up to a point to the current discussion, and that would be that while connecting the cities from one point to other point, we somehow lost the connection of like people from one side of the road connecting to the other side of the road. Like if I want to go for a grocery, how the hell am I going to like cross the road, which is probably 6 to 7 lanes wide, and then like get my groceries or like basic things. So that's one point. And second point is people have lost the sense of ownership. I think since there is a lot of migration and a lot of money invested, and all the changing nature of the spaces, while amalgamating different type of spaces, we created neighborhoods which people don't feel belong to, and that is probably why they live in maybe areas like Okhla, and you would see utter garbage over there, and people still living over there with no quality of living standards as such. So yeah.
So connecting many of the concerns that we all seem to share with some sense of concern and anger and frustration. I'm also thinking of what Swati said, which is Swati said, and also what Vishal said about how do we create a sense of belonging. I'm really wondering, is there a possibility of looking at this very large population of university students? We have now Sonipat, 2 really major universities, and Gurgaon, multiple universities, more coming up in Sonipat. Is there a way that we can utilize those campuses and the communities there to begin to create some of these conversations for thinking differently, maybe with less apathy? Many of those universities actually encourage interventions of that kind. And I don't know if there are NGOs who work in this sort of stuff, but those are very, very often people who don't belong to Delhi but might settle in Delhi, or they come from other parts of Delhi. I'm just wondering, is there hope there to look at those 10, 20,000 young people?
She's been wanting to ask.
Sorry, just I quickly want to support the gentleman who started the discussion on not sleeping because seeing how our cities are built. I also have the same issue. And in fact, I want to bring here the notion of human rights. There have been a number of studies done showing that these kind of clustered spaces without open views, without greenery, actually are damaging our physical and mental health. For example, the World Health Organization says that in a city, minimum, we should have 9 square meters of greenery per citizen. So Indian cities, we have done an assessment. Most of them are between 1 and 2, 3, 5, depends. Delhi actually is a little higher than that. But so isn't it a human right to have a space where you can feel a minimum of comfort? And I'm surprised that we are having these projects such as you mentioned that are coming up more and more, and yet we are not voicing it out, because building such things, it's not like creating an ugly painting and the day you don't like it, you put it in a cupboard. You're locking yourself into a living pattern for decades. And yet we are letting it happen more and more. So, I mean, I don't know, it's just I'm sharing my feelings. I wonder, is there anything we can do to stop just claiming our human right to live in a decent environment, basically?
Sorry,
Okay,
I
so
quickly wanted to tell you that School of Planning and Architecture's urban design group had worked with Khoj on the public art project, which was 48 degrees. So those initiatives do happen. It's just that to pull them off, an organization takes a huge beating. I mean, if you were to sit and talk to Pooja Sood at Khoj and discuss what went through to pull off a 48 degrees, which was a public art project, the whole thing about getting permissions, the whole thing about getting funding, the will is always there. It's always there to work with young students. And I mean, last time I went to speak at SPA, I just told the students to take the sledgehammer and go at it. Like, they don't pent up that anger. Just take it out, not physically, of course, but take it out in a way where you can start making a difference. And then you have to just say, okay, each one of you start all by yourselves. Take ownership and then move forward, or make collectives. It's very important to start looking at collective making now. So architects, artists no longer need to work with the old really rubbish idea of the architect being the ego person or the engineer being the ego. You can make collectives now, and you don't need to put your name or stamp your name just to say that all the credit should come to you. I mean, there is also that greed which needs to be let go of. I don't know, I see it that way, and I don't know what others would have to say about it.